I know we're a little behind schedule, but we'll get caught up, I promise you. Our next speaker is Dr. Lok Sang Ho. He is Dean of Business at Chu Hai College of Higher Education in Hong Kong. Prior to that, he was Professor of Economics and Director of the Center of Public Policy Studies. He has published widely, not only books, but articles, and you can read the titles in the program. But he has been involved, for example, as the president of the Hong Kong Economic Association for 8 years through 2007. He was an advisor for the Hong Kong Institute of Monetary Research from 1999 to 2009. He has also served as a member of the Hong Kong Committee of the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, the Central Policy Unit of the Hong Kong SAR government, the Standing Commission on Civil Service Salaries and Conditions of Service, and the Task Force on Digital Inclusion. In 2016, he was granted the Bronze Bahá'í Star for his contributions in public policy studies. The topic of his talk today is non-physical infrastructure for building a better world. Please welcome Dr. Ho to the podium.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this very good conference. I learned a lot. I'm very happy to share some of my ideas on infrastructure and happiness. Infrastructure is a form of capital, and as capital, it has to be accumulated, and it takes time to accumulate infrastructure, to build infrastructure. It's important to understand that infrastructure facilitates, but at the same time it may constrain. It may even implode, for example, with the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It was a disaster. It was a major disaster. And with the Fukushima power plant. So infrastructure is costly and takes time to build, and it's costly to maintain and even more costly to rebuild. So it's important to make sure that we have the right infrastructure so that we have the opportunity to make the most of our lives. As capital, it's a factor of production contributing to a flow of services that support or enrich life in different ways. And this is also true of non-physical infrastructure, which I'm going to talk about. We have already heard so much about physical infrastructure so far. I mean, when I talk about non-physical infrastructure, in particular, I mean institutions, values, cultures. This non-physical infrastructure define our living environment, our social environment, and mold our thinking. It may even condition the physical infrastructure, which is built, constructed under the influence of non-physical infrastructure. Infrastructure has all of these kinds which we are pretty familiar with, but non-physical infrastructure includes laws and institutions, norms and customs, organizations and rules, etc. We want infrastructure that serves us now, but we also want it not to constrain us unduly over the long term, and certainly want it not to implode. So we need to plan our infrastructure carefully to make sure that it serves our purpose. And in terms of soft infrastructure or institutions, I would like to point out that there are two kinds, Okay, the first is open institutions, and the second is relatively closed institutions. And what do I mean by that? If you look at this, there are two ways in which you have closed infrastructure. The first one is when you have vested interests wielding power, which is concentrated in the hands of a few, and this power is used to preserve the interests of the vested interests. So you have a closed loop, and it's very difficult to break out of that because the vested interests will make sure that they use the power to ensure that they will continue to enjoy those benefits. Alternatively, it may seem to be, you can see in the second panel here, you can have concentrated power and feeding into rules, values, and practices which are venerated, that is respected, it's untouchable, it's something that, that no one dares to criticize. Okay, if you have that, then it's very difficult to break out of the loop. It also represents another kind of very close infrastructure. So, for example, you have a clergy, okay, that at the same time has exclusive power, okay, to politics, and then you have a loop like that, and that is why I congratulate America for having this separation of church and state, and I think it's very important. I would like to point out that even formal infrastructure, formal democracies, which you would expect to be open society, okay, open institutions, but formal democracies may not necessarily be that open as open as we may think, as there exists such a thing as illiberal democracies, as described by Zakaria, who wrote this very famous article in the Foreign Affairs, the Rise of Illiberal Democracy in 1997. It shows that without a culture of reciprocity and respect for all, even though you may have formal democracy, you may have the ballot box to choose your leaders, you may still have a society that falls victim to a vicious circle of significant interest groups preserving themselves. And they, of course, these interest groups may fight among themselves, okay, but they remain, okay, interest groups defending their own, using the power to defend their own interests, and to the detriment of the powerless. And there was actually an article written by some Princeton University political scientists. The paper has shown that, say, in America, the man in the street doesn't have much sway to power. It's always the big business that has sway to power. Why do I focus on non-physical infrastructure? And that is because non-physical infrastructure conditions the evolution of physical infrastructure. And it conditions and shapes our minds and bodies over the longer term. So let us not overlook the importance of soft infrastructure. Now, so what kind of soft infrastructure do we need to build a happier world? First of all, it has to be inclusive. It has to be capable of evolving. At any given time, of course, it's okay not to have a perfect society, but it's important that it will evolve for the better. So if you have an open society that is capable of improving itself, then we have hope. It has to contain the dark sides of human nature, that is to check against power abuses. It has to liberate the mind, So no dogmas. It has to be pragmatic, based on evidence-based rationality for the common good. It has to arouse aspirations for transcendence, that is to appeal to the awareness of the common roots of humanity, that we share common roots through the human existence. And I would like to share some evidence from, say, in Europe, during the so-called Middle Ages, the medieval period had several features such as feudalism and religious faith as interpreted by the Roman Catholic Church of the time. And it was a very closed society at the time. And those features combined to form a society that was very rigid socially, religiously, and politically. And in China, we have seen a period of golden age that is called the Warring States of China, and during that period. And you can see that it's from the 6th century to 221 BC, during the spring and autumn period. This is called the spring and autumn period. And at that time, that's the golden age of Chinese philosophy, because so many ideas come out. It's the Renaissance of China at that time. And why was it possible? And that was because during the time, there was no single source of power that holds the society together, and that rigid political structure is gone. Okay, the country was actually divided, and it's fighting each other. The different small states within China were fighting each other, but ideas were quite free, and lots of innovation, lots of ideas, lots of philosophy schools. And if you look at more modern times, during the Mao Zedong period, at that time, ideas actually constrained, okay, put into a jail, sort of. And there was little innovation, and it was an extremely closed society and highly dogmatic. It's not possible to criticize. It's very difficult to criticize. No ideas come from the population. Institutions were serious constraint to innovations and to self-actualization. But then, with the opening up of China, things changed dramatically. Okay, so you can see that with an open society, we've seen innovation, we've seen lots of ideas, and today we have poets, okay, from among the peasants, okay, and workers, working class, and they are actually pretty active online, sharing the ideas. They write novels, and some of them became famous and even turned into a TV drama series, and some of them make good money too. And so we go back to that question that I raised earlier on. When we have electoral democracy, it does not necessarily offer a better model. Even though you may have electoral democracy, you still need to have effective mechanism to prevent power abuses. Otherwise, even though you may have the ballot box, it's not enough. Power abuses is defined as using the power obtained through elections to further sectoral interests and hold the elected officials accountable to their sectoral interests. As an elected official, you want to be accountable to your constituents. So who are your constituents? The constituents elected you because you give them favors, right? So it's a kind of trade. But then, because you're accountable to your constituents, you may forget the common interest, okay? Because all that you need to do is to make sure that you can win your votes. And those people who have money, who can support your campaign, they ultimately, they make you responsible to them, and you have to be accountable to them, sort of. And China offers a different model. Sometimes it's called meritocracy, but China suffers from a relative lack of checks and balances based on an independent judiciary and lack of press freedom. So China itself, even though it has opened up a lot, much better than during the Mao period, but it's still not good enough. And I am hoping that China can improve its rule of law and can open up the press. Now, right now, we are waiting to see whether the Chinese system, with its so-called meritocracy system, and whether the Western democracy system, okay, with competing parties, whether they will converge. There's a chance that they converge if in the Western world we have a multi-party system. If the different parties, instead of representing different interest groups, if they're just different ways of ways of thinking to serve the best interest of the country, maybe there can be a dialogue. Maybe eventually, you know, they can drop the party names and they can come together, you know, because just serving the country. So why is it necessary to have different parties? Okay, all that is needed is to find the best idea to serve the best interest of the country, right? But if you have different parties representing different interests, then it's very difficult, you know, to serve the best interest of the country. So I'm hoping that in time, maybe the two models will converge. Now let me share some ideas about happiness, because that's really basic to the theme of this conference. And as an economist, I use this concept, which was proposed by Gary Becker of the University of Chicago. He proposed the concept of household production. The idea is that utility, and I just I use the term utility and happiness interchangeably. If utility is based on two kinds of goods, okay, one I call physical goods, and the other I call mental goods. Okay, physical goods is very clear. Okay, material well-being. Okay, like food, clothing, and so on. Okay, material goods, comfort. And how about mental goods? Now, mental goods is like love, peace of mind, being accepted by others as friends or members of a community, and a sense of autonomy. You feel that you're on top of yourself. You don't need to be a slave. Okay, you have your freedom. You have your sense of freedom. You have your autonomy, self-esteem, and sense of achievement, and so on. Self-efficacy. All of this is mental good. You feel good because you have a sense of autonomy, and you have a sense of achievement. And physical goods is like, okay, the nutrition that you get, okay, when you, and the taste and so on, okay, that you can derive from the food. And Gary Becker's idea of household production is that whether it's a physical goods or whether it's mental goods, ultimately, you do not just go to the market and buy all of those things that you consume. After buying the goods, you still have to undergo household activity. Say you cook a meal, okay, so you have to put in time. And you have to transform the inputs that you put in and turn them into output. And that output is the so-called end goods that actually contribute to your happiness or your enjoyment. Okay, so household production is a process of turning input into output. Okay, input includes the time input that you have to put in your household activity. And when you just consider some of the household activity that we may perform, like you invite some friends and to a dinner party, and so you prepare the venue, and you cook, and you have good company and enjoy the food, right? So that's the household activity in which, at the same time, you have mental goods and you also have physical goods generated, because you not only do you enjoy the meal and get the nutrition and the taste, you also enjoy the friendship, and that's a mental good. Okay, so through this household activity, you can get the mental good. And I would argue that infrastructure is important to the generation of not only commercial goods, but also the production of mental goods. And so infrastructure helps public good production, commercial production, as well as household production, and contributes to happiness. Non-physical infrastructure shapes the course of evolution of culture, and note that this matters to the efficiency of household production. Now think about a concept which was proposed with Kenneth Galbraith's book, Affluent Society, and also by another author, Veblen. What's conspicuous consumption? Conspicuous consumption is you use up a lot of resources in order to impress on people that you are capable of consuming so much, right? Like, okay, you have a beautiful yacht, a beautiful boat on which you can entertain, and people invited will know that you can spend that kind of money, right? Why do you do that? You do that because you can enhance a sense of self-esteem. Okay, you can spend that kind of money, right? But I would argue that self-esteem is something that I need, you need, everybody needs. But some people use conspicuous consumption, that kind of activity, in order to get self-esteem, right? But other people do not need to spend that much money, okay, to get the same mental goods. You see, the idea is that all of us need similar kinds of mental goods and physical goods in order to have a fulfilling life. But some people, because of the culture, they have to spend so much in order to get the same goods. And that shows that, okay, under some culture, some kind of culture, which is, say, I would say the materialistic, conspicuous consumption kind of culture, you have a very inefficient household production function. Okay, very inefficient household production, so that you need to put in so much resource, but you also get a self-esteem, right? But other people with an alternative kind of culture, you don't need to use up so much resource. So you can have a much more sustainable world if you have the right kind of culture. And that culture is part of that institution. And I would also note that production can churn out bads and not goods, like pollution, climate change, and more accidents, worse accidents, and so on. Now, these are a result of human activity. Okay, human activity also produces different kinds of bads, and and among those bads, you may have mental bads like racism, hate, divisiveness, insecurity, anxiety, and so on. And ultimately, we want to have a society in which we can enjoy all those goods and less of the bads. Then how can you have that? So first of all, we have to think about what kind of soft infrastructure that can make a better world. First one would be inclusiveness. Inclusiveness is easy to say, but difficult to put into practice. And that is because bias is entrenched in the minds of people, in social institutions, in physical infrastructure, and sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes less subtle ways. People worry about losing the identities or being overwhelmed by others who are different. Think about the rise of these so-called right-wing parties that are now emerging in various parts of Europe. Now, they are very concerned about the large flow of immigrants. And think about Brexit. Why does Britain want Brexit? And what part of that is because they are concerned about the inflow of migrants. And they worry about, in particular, they worry about Muslims, many of them. And I have also seen some worrying trends in population. People say that, okay, the Muslims, the fertility rate is so high, okay? And soon, Europe will be no longer the Europe as we know it today, because it will become a Muslim Europe, okay? Because the Muslims will have many children, and they all become Muslims. And so some people worry, right? And that is why it is important to arrest this kind of worry. But will Merkel be able to do it? People are not convinced. People are not convinced. And that is because we lack laws, we lack the institutions that will ensure reciprocity. And now I propose this concept of reciprocity, which is an important aspect of inclusive institutions. Reciprocity and laws that ensure reciprocity among different social groups and communities. What exactly do I mean by that? And in particular, I would like to point to religious freedom. Let us think about what exactly is meant by religious freedom. Religious freedom means that people are allowed to choose their own religion, right? And if people can choose the religion, it means that parents are not supposed to force the children into adopting the religion. The children have to pick their own religion, given the opportunity to compare and pick their own religion. And people can be converted from one religion to another religion. There shouldn't be any restriction. And that is religious freedom. But on the other hand, in today's world, there are people who insist that for a member of their religion, converting to another religion is an act of betrayal and must be condemned. And today, in countries that truly practice religious freedom, marriage is typically believed to be a matter strictly between the two adults who choose to marry. But there are people who insist that someone with an alien religion, first of all, they have to convert to your religion before the marriage can be carried out. And after converting into your religion, he must not be allowed to convert back to another religion, right? So this is not reciprocity. So reciprocity requires immigrants to accept reciprocity and outlawing religious sects that reject reciprocity. And I think that's an important element in the law that will allow us to free ourselves from this fear of these migrants. If an immigrant comes to your country, he must promise to accept religious freedom. He must accept reciprocity. And reciprocity is basic. If you do not accept reciprocity and accept religious freedom, then you are not entitled to religious freedom. Different religions have different theologies and reflecting the different cultural and historical contexts in which they emerge. But let us not let these differences in theology, which reflected the context in which they emerged, let us think about the essence of the different religions. If you think about the essence of the teachings, there is not really that much difference between different religions. And if you insist on the different theologies and the fundamentalists, then of course religions will clash with one another. But if you accept that these theologies are different only because they emerge in different cultural contexts and historical contexts, then there need not be too much concern about this clash. And there's more attention on the essence of the teachings. And I would argue that the essence of different religions is actually very much the same. For example, just the concept or the practice of mindfulness. And I discover that even Muslims, they talk about Islamic mindfulness. And in Judaism, Jews also talk about mindfulness. And a rabbi wrote this, Judaism at its very core is all about mindfulness. So you can see that different religions practice the same spiritual teachings. And this is from a Muslim source, and it talks about mindfulness, and the ideas are actually shared, common ideas across different religions. But the theology is somewhat different. But that is not important. And I had proposed a charter. I proposed a charter a few years back in a conference which I organized. This is part of the soft institution that I propose. I argue that all religions shall take as the mission the promotion of peace, including inner peace and peace between nations, races, and different cultures. All religious leaders shall accept that the different theologies of the different religions owe the origins to their different historical and cultural backgrounds. Such different theologies do not affect the commonality of their teachings in terms of spiritual practice. Spiritual practice requires an abstention from killing and other violent acts and a respect for life. Religions offer different routes to the same destination, which may be considered as adaptations to suit different peoples in different cultures. And it's the substance of the religion that is important, and not the labels. Regardless of the label, all religious practices that liberate the mind from the enslavement of greed, lust, anger, hatred, ill will, and unforgivingness are true and laudable spiritual practice. Spiritual practice constitutes the essential teachings of all religions, unlike theology. The theologies of religions may differ and may conflict with science as we know it today. But theologies are like the parables that Jesus and the Buddha used to guide people to spiritual practice. And it's the essential spiritual messages behind the parables that really matter. And another aspect of good institutions is the capability to evolve while preserving the aspiration for the higher good, which should never change. How we live up to those aspirations can and should change because we learn. And we need to distinguish between means and ends, and we need to have that courage to evolve while preserving the essential values for the higher good. And we need to have institutions that contain the dark sides of human nature to prevent power abuses. The right kind of culture can serve to check against the dark sides of human nature. And this is also part of soft infrastructure, because if we all do not tolerate corruption, we have the culture of not tolerating corruption. Corruption will die, okay, because you do not tolerate it. Another aspect is that institutions have to liberate the mind, and humility is an attitude of lifelong learning premised on the equality of human beings rather than the distinction between races. And we need to arouse the aspirations for transcendence, arousing our awareness to our common roots as members of humanity. So we need to have infrastructure conducive to arousing love, wisdom, fortitude, and engagement. And I use this LIFE, which is life, okay, to mark these important spiritual teachings that are common to all religions. And that is the happiness formula that I propose. And Martin Seligman in his book, Authentic Happiness, had proposed this happiness formula. S is set range. So it is happiness is supposed to rise or fall within that range. Okay, so that is called a set range. And that set range is according to Seligman, is fixed. That's why it's called set. And V is voluntary elements, and C is circumstances. And I changed it slightly to the second line there, and you can see that happiness is now consists of S plus C. S is the so-called set range, and C is circumstances. And the S becomes not exactly set in stone, but it's a relatively permanent range of happiness that is determined by two factors. One is genetic. G1 is the genetic, given. Okay, G means given. Okay, V is nurtured. It's called mental capital, and that is part of the infrastructure that we have to build up. Okay, we have to accumulate this mental capital. And what is that mental capital all about? The mental capital is actually about habit formation. We need to form habits. Okay, for example, when we talk about humility, okay, humility is a habit. We need to nurture that kind of habit. And that is actually your infrastructure within you, and that will make you open up to more ideas. And the circumstances also consist of one element that is given, That's why G, okay? But the other element is V, okay? The voluntary factor is important in determining circumstances too, because with your voluntary action, you can change circumstances in your future. What you do today is going to affect the circumstances in which you find yourself in the future, okay? And that is why, even though we observe people's happiness, the range of happiness seems to be relatively stable, actually, with time, it is possible to build up your mental capital so that the range of happiness can shift up, okay? And that is the V1, the role of V1, the first voluntary factor, which is building up that healthy mental habit, so you have mental capital. And the second V is using your voluntary action to make your circumstances better in the future. So V2 refers to decisions that lead to changes in circumstances down the road. And physical infrastructure and institutions are also a determinant of G2. And G2 is something that the individual has to take as given. Okay, whatever physical infrastructure out there is taken as given by the individual. That is why we need to be sure that the infrastructure is conducive to good. So what needs to be done? We need to build infrastructure that make every peace-loving individual feel he is not threatened and treat all equally, and that include a safety net for the unfortunate, and that institutions that prevent power abuses. We need to dismantle or improve institutions that threatens an individual whose only sin is that he does not conform. So that is inclusive. Huh? We need to dismantle or improve institutions that directly or indirectly fosters power abuses. We need to establish the rule of law and humane laws. We need to protect press freedom within the constraint of the law. And we need to nurture a culture of love, insight, fortitude, and engagement. So my conclusions here, to build a better world, we need to start from our hearts and start thinking. We have to think about how to improve our physical infrastructure so that they can be inclusive and effective in meeting the needs of members, all members of society. We need to be forward-looking and inclusive in design. We need to think about how to improve our institutions and cultural heritage so that they can be inclusive and positive in cultivating the values of love, insight, fortitude, and engagement, so we all accumulate the spiritual capital that unites us all. Thank you. Yes, sure.
Questions?
Thank you very much. Very much enjoyed your presentation. I have two questions, one very short.
Thank you.
The spiritual capital concept, I was just wondering, have you written about that somewhere? Like, is that formalized in writing?
Which capital?
The spiritual capital that
Spiritual
you
capital,
mentioned.
yes.
Yes.
Yes, I've written about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And my second question is, what suggestions, given our current world climate, I would say in many ways, like we see a lot of conservative rising around the world, not just Europe, in the United States. You know, for instance, we see these things. And one of your suggestions is that we dismantle institutions that threaten individuals whose only sin is that they're different and that foster power abuses. In contexts like these, where we have so much fear that is growing around the world, what are some suggestions you have for maybe starting that spiritual capital that we need, or challenging these particular regimes that are fostering the fear that we see now?
Yeah. I have already suggested that it's important to have the law that ensures reciprocity so that we can actually truly enjoy religious freedom. If we have true religious freedom and reciprocity, and with the understanding and agreement among the religious leaders that theology is not the most important thing. Theology just reflects the cultural background of the different religions. But if you think about the actual teachings of religions, it's the spiritual teachings that is really the substance. And then if you have that understanding, and if you have a law that ensures reciprocity, and any sect that denies reciprocity is not entitled to religious freedom, so it's actually outlawed in the first place. Okay, if you have that, okay, then I would say that there will be less fear and there will be less discrimination against, for example, Muslims. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Very difficult, yes. Very difficult. Yeah, that's very difficult, yeah. There are two things. One is easy, the other one is difficult. But let us begin with the easy part, okay? The easy part is legislate, okay, to enact laws that take away the religious freedom of those who do not respect reciprocity, who actually deny other people's religious freedom. Okay, if they want religious freedom, they have to respect reciprocity in the first place. They have to respect other people's religious freedom. Okay, so you can have a law like that, okay, which is not too difficult because it can be enacted. Okay, and the second part is much more difficult, but when the law has been legislated, then changing the minds of people becomes easier. You see, and that is difficult. But without that law, it's impossible. You see, so I'm suggesting that you take the easy path first and let more people, let the senators, everyone, all the legislators, let them do the part, okay, to legislate so as to ensure reciprocity so that we can actually enjoy religious freedom. Okay, once we have that, then we can educate people. But without that, it's impossible, you know, because you have some people who actually deny other people's religious freedom and they become stronger and stronger, okay, and they become bigger and bigger community because they force the children to think like them, you see, and then how can you blame people who fear, right? People naturally will fear when you have that. So I'm saying that if you have, first of all, you have the law that protects religious freedom by ensuring reciprocity and outlawing those sects, okay, that deny reciprocity, okay? And you need to have religious leaders who agree to those terms, to my charter, and then you can educate, okay? And then there will be less fear, okay? Because children will not necessarily become that particular religion, and they are not allowed to practice a religion if they do not respect other people's religious freedom in the first place, right? And then we can have a more peaceful world. Thank you.
So we will have a very quick break. I would like to just suggest if we could just break for 10 minutes, and our next speaker is here, Dr. Graham, and I'm looking forward to introducing her to you. So there's more, I think, refreshed coffee and tea and cookies back there. So 10 minutes, please. Okay? Thank you.